In this video, we'll be answering the question, what is a DPS? A DPS, or Dynamic Purchasing System, is a procedure that public sector bodies sometimes follow to find suitably qualified suppliers within the market. Unlike your typical tender, where suppliers submit their bids and the highest scoring tender wins, the DPS operates a little differently. Suppliers are first invited to apply for the DPS. Applications should be open all year round for the lifetime of the DPS and open to all suppliers. The application process is a lot like the first stage of the restricted procedure or two-stage tendering process. It is essentially a series of qualification criteria, and the buyer sets a number of minimum requirements that suppliers must meet to join the DPS. So you will be facing a series of questions, typically yes or no questions, where you will have to self-certify that you meet these minimum requirements. The buyer will then have 10 days to evaluate your application and let you know the outcome. If you fail, don't worry, you can reapply again. There's no limit on the number of attempts that you can make to apply for a DPS. If you're successful, however, you're now part of that DPS. This means that you're on the list with other qualifying suppliers. Now, when the buyer wants to conduct a more detailed competition or tender, they are allowed to only invite those suppliers that are currently part of the DPS. This second phase runs almost exactly the same way as a normal tender, where you must submit responses to quality questions and pricing, which are all scored to help the buyer identify the winner. Remember, the suppliers can apply to join a DPS at any time. This is what makes it dynamic. So this kind of procedure can be quite demanding for buyers. So why do they use a DPS? As mentioned, the second stage is limited to only those suppliers on the DPS. This means that the buyer is restricting the number of tenders it will receive and ensuring that only those that have already met the minimum criteria are bidding. So how is this different from a framework? Although there are a number of procedural differences, we'll cover the main functional differences here. A framework works in a very similar way, except that the application stage is only open for a short period of time. This means the new suppliers in the market might miss an opportunity to join the framework if the competition is already closed. The number of suppliers on a framework are fixed for the lifetime of the framework. The open door policy of a DPS, however, means the suppliers on the list can constantly change, keeping the tendering process more competitive. The DPS is a great tool where the market is constantly changing. It also helps buyers manage the number of tenders that come through the door. So if you're interested in applying for a DPS, remember, the application process should be pretty straightforward and probably won't take a great deal of time. The work comes when the buyer then runs a tender for all DPS suppliers. There's no guarantee of any contracts by being on a DPS, but it does mean that you will be able to bid for contracts that otherwise you wouldn't. Visit www.frameworker.co.uk for more information and tendering resources.